Good evening. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. And on behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this evening's program online. I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters for the Kennedy Library Forum's lead sponsors, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and CVS Health, as well as the Mass Cultural Council and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. We're so delighted to have this opportunity to examine Franklin Delano Roosevelt's work in World War II and consider what his guidance and work might what guidance his work might have for us today. Is particularly timely at our location because we have a special exhibit on World War II that connects with so many themes from the book. I'm so pleased to extend a warm welcome virtually to the library to Mr. Paul Sparrow, former colleague of mine. He is a writer, historical consultant, and former director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. And before moving to the FDR Library, he was the deputy director of the Newseum in Washington, and he began his career at KPIX, the CBS affiliate in San Francisco, and became an Emmy Award-winning television producer working with Discovery, Fox, and PBS. Paul, thank you so much for joining us this evening to discuss your incredible new book, Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh and the Battle to Save Democracy. I love this book. It is riveting. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Alan. I'm so excited to be here tonight. I'm a big fan of yours. You're doing a fantastic job up there at the JFK Library. And of course, you know, the Kennedys and the Roosevelts have a long history.
Tell us about the many connections between the Kennedys and the Roosevelts, some of which I learned in the book, some of which I already knew, but I think there are even more in your head than I'm aware of.
Well, they traveled in similar social circles particularly when the Kennedys lived in New York before they relocated up to Boston. But they first met FDR and Joe Kennedy met in 1918 during World War I when FDR was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and Joe Kennedy had volunteered, was working at Four Points Naval Shipyard in Quincy. And they sort of struck up a friendship and then were associates, friends, partners, competitors for the next 40 years. I mean, one of the most interesting things about Joe Kennedy's support for FDR was that he supported him when he ran for governor in 1928, and he supported him when he ran for president in 1932. And there was some question about what role that he would play in the new FDR administration in the New Deal. And of course, Joe Kennedy had made a lot of money on the stock market. And so FDR decided to make him the first head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which generated a lot of very interesting and amusing headlines. And as FDR famously said, who better to guard the hen house than the fox? And then Roosevelt put Joe Kennedy in several different positions during the administration. Their children knew each other, and actually quite a remarkable story. In 1933, Joe Kennedy and James Roosevelt, FDR's oldest son, traveled to England to try to set up an exclusive deal for distributing scotch and gin, British liquor, in the United States as we were coming out of Prohibition. And James neglected to tell his father that he was doing this. And one of the reasons Joe brought James with him was to arrange a meeting with Winston Churchill. So James Roosevelt actually met Winston Churchill before his father did. And Kennedy, of course, met Winston Churchill then and then was FDR's ambassador to the court of St. James in the late 30s and early 40s. So yeah, a very interesting and complicated friendship.
Amazing. And you showed me before, last time I visited the FDR Library and Museum, some of the correspondence between FDR and RFK.
Yeah. There was correspondence there, sort of remarkable correspondence between Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, because she lived until 1962. So during the rise of the Kennedy clan politically in Washington, she was very involved. She had a somewhat contentious relationship with JFK when he was a senator, feeling he hadn't been strong enough in civil rights. RFK wrote a letter to FDR, and FDR signed it and sent his autograph back to him. But the most interesting thing for me is that Eleanor Roosevelt had supported Adlai Stevenson in the when he ran against Eisenhower, and then in the primary in the 1960 election, she supported Adlai Stevenson, but Kennedy won the nomination. Now, at that point, Eleanor was the most powerful woman in the Democratic Party, one of the most famous women in the world, and JFK went up to her home in Valkill to earn her support, to try to get her to endorse him. And after a very, very candid meeting where Eleanor really put the screws to him about his plans and his policies, particularly around civil rights and global national security, she decided to endorse him. And not only did she endorse him, but she traveled the country and campaigned for him. So, that the Roosevelt Kennedy relationship runs all the way through till his election. And once JFK became president, he appointed her to head the Commission on the Status of Women. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, quite remarkable.
When I think about, when a person comes of age in the United States, and whoever is the president for a certain phase of their life makes a deep impression on them, because FDR is president for such a long time. I think for JFK, it's essentially from his age 16 to 28. For Bobby, it's from age 8 to 20. That's their whole image of what a president is. I can only imagine that that part of the JFK origin story and framing what it means to be a president is absolutely shaped by FDR.
No question about that. You see it in the language. I mean, I think if you think about some of FDR's famous speeches and you think about some of JFK's famous speeches, ask not what your country can do for you. These are based on this deep belief that we all have a responsibility to be good citizens, to serve our country. And I think that was instilled in the Roosevelt family. It was instilled deeply in the Kennedy family. I mean, obviously, JFK's older brother, died flying an incredibly dangerous mission during World War II. And we all know the story about, JFK and PT 109. So, and all four of the Roosevelt boys served in the war, including one on a destroyer and one, Elliott Roosevelt flew aerial reconnaissance missions over enemy territory in a unarmed Mosquito fast bomber, incredibly dangerous mission. So I think that you can look at that generation and say they served with honor and dignity, despite the fact that they could easily have gotten out of certainly dangerous service, but they all served and they served with honor.
Well, and I would say that noble ideal and idealism is absolutely held in common. And one of
Absolutely.
the, I'm going to read a couple of passages from your book because I felt like those words were echoing across time from FDR to JFK and through to today. And I'd love for you to say more on it. I'll read two completely different sections. You referenced that in July of 1940, Churchill was writing to Roosevelt, pleading for America to enter the war, and his words are, "Mr. President, with great respect, I must tell you that in the long history of the world, this is the thing to do now." And of course, in JFK's inaugural address, the line is, "In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been called upon to defend freedom in its hour of maximum danger." And I just thought there's an interesting parallel there. And then again, reading in the book, I'm stitching a couple of things together, but I found it fascinating. And we'll talk more about Anne Lindbergh later, but there's a particular phrase that she uses, thinking that totalitarianism is the wave of the future. And Roosevelt says, "There are some who say that democracy cannot cope with the new techniques of government." And then JFK in Berlin says, "There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin." And I just thought, history, there, he is a student of history, and he is clearly a student of what happened in World War II He's referencing Churchill, he's referencing Roosevelt, and he's referencing Lindbergh in the same way that Roosevelt was smashing that idea.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I got deeply immersed in when I was the director of the FDR library started on my first day there. And Alan, you probably had a similar experience. Your first day, the staff brings out all the goodies and shows you all the great holdings. And one of the
Yes.
things that they showed me was the first page of FDR's Day of Infamy speech that he dictated to his assistant on December 7th, and the worst day of his life, worst day of his presidency, worst military defeat in American history, between meeting with congressional leaders and military leaders in his cabinet. And Grace Tully, his assistant, describes in her autobiography that she came in to take the speech and he looked up at the ceiling and then he dictated the entire speech off the top of his head, complete with punctuation. And she went up and typed it up and brought it back. And anyway, the first page of that first draft, the first sentence, he gets his pencil out. The first sentence read originally December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in world history. And he
Mm,
crosses out world history, he writes in the word infamy, and then he puts a little dash to indicate he needs to pause there. And it struck me then, and it has struck me ever since then, the power of that one word.
yes.
We have now come to define that day, that whole experience, as the day of infamy. And that
Mhm.
one word took on a life and a power of its own. Words matter, particularly when they're spoken by the president of the United States. And so,
Yes.
because of that first day and looking at that document, I became deeply interested in his speeches. I looked at all his speeches, I read them. They have what they call the master speech file. You have one at the JFK library, which is all of the drafts of all of the speeches. So you can go back and see how the speeches evolved, see his fingerprints on the really important speeches. And his use of persuasive language, his ability to persuade the American public. So when Germany invades Poland on September 1st, 1939, 70% or more of Americans opposed any involvement. They did not want the United States getting involved in this European war. And over the next 2 years, FDR shifts that public opinion to where right before Pearl Harbor, about 70% of Americans do support American involvement in the war. And it's done gradually and slowly through this persuasive language and through his ability to really communicate with people that you see his ability to change public opinion. And that power of words is sort of the core message of this book.
Well, again, extraordinary. I'm wondering, you make the case at the beginning, and I think you back it up very well when you say no president in American history had a more significant impact on both American and world history than Franklin Roosevelt. Can you say more about why you make that claim?
Well, the obvious answer is that he served for 12 years, so he served longer than anybody else. But also, he took over as president of the United States, at 3 years into the Great Depression, at a point in which the future of democracy itself, certainly the future of capitalism and democracy, were in question. There were other countries, other forms of government arising around the world, fascism and totalitarianism, communism, and there was a question of whether democracy itself was still viable. As you said, the book, Anne Murrow's book, The Wave of the Future, talking about totalitarianism being the future and democracy being the past. He didn't believe that. He believed that democracy was the best form of government and that it was his responsibility to prove that democracy could work. So not only did he help America recover from the Great Depression, change the very foundation of how our government worked. The fact that the government, up until Franklin Roosevelt, was interested primarily in providing support for business and Wall Street and investors, and had no role in helping the common man, the forgotten man, as FDR called him. And FDR changed that. He said, no, the federal government has a direct responsibility to help people. And so then you see all of his legacies, Social Security and the minimum wage and 40-hour work weeks and unions and environmental protections, all those things that came out of his administration. And I think it changed not just America economically and socially, but it changed the world. It set a model for how the rest of the world should think about the responsibilities of government to their people. And then, of course, in World War II, he was able to bring together this coalition of nations to fight fascism. And his vision, he was always thinking 5 years down the road. Now, it took a long time for the U.S. to get involved in the war because Americans didn't want to get involved in the war. But even before American involvement, he does the Four Freedoms speech, where he talks about how everywhere in the world there should be freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom from fear and freedom from want. And he's setting up this sort of moral imperative for Americans to understand that our core, what I call the awakening the spirit of America was that we're willing to fight for freedom, right? The very origin story of America is that we were willing to take on the most powerful empire in the world with a bunch of farmers and muskets to fight for our freedom. And that his point was that if we're willing to fight for our own freedom, we have to be willing to fight for freedom for other people everywhere. And that's why I think that he changed the world, not just from an economic and societal point of view. He changed the world from a military standpoint point of view. He made America the first superpower. His great Arsenal Democracy speech really radically realigned American industry, American foreign policy, the American military establishment. Now, there are those, including me, who feel that maybe the military-industrial complex has gotten too powerful. Certainly, President Eisenhower felt so, and he warned about it in his farewell address. But he did shift the balance of power, and he created the United Nations. As flawed as it may be, it has prevented another world war for 80 years. So we have to look at that and say, that's what he set out to do, and so far he was successful.
Well, I love his, I'll just call it attention to detail and choosing his words carefully and making analogies that every American can understand. This notion of if your neighbor's house is on fire and you have a hose, you should lend your neighbor the hose, right? I mean, everybody can get that.
It's such a brilliant, he had a lot of visual metaphors that he would use, like in his first fireside chat, after he'd closed all the banks in America and they're about to reopen the banks the next day. His first fireside chat's only 13 minutes long, but he talks about the Emergency Banking Act and that it's safer to put your money in a reopened bank than it is to keep it under your mattress. Now, why is that brilliant? Because people had taken their money out of the bank and stuck it under their mattresses, right? It was
Yes.
a real reference. Today, it seems ridiculous, but back then, there was no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. If a bank failed and you hadn't gotten your money out, you lost everything. That was it.
Yeah.
And so he's able to put very complex issues into a language that people can understand. One of my favorites is that, in late 1941, the biggest threat to the British, to Winston Churchill, were the U-boats.
Yes.
Because Britain, as an island nation with Europe now under the domination of the Nazis, its only source of supply was across the North Atlantic from the United States and Canada. Mm-hmm. And the German U-boats were wreaking havoc on the cargo ships, sinking them at a rate far faster than we could replace them. And of course, sending millions of tons of cargo, preciously needed cargo, to the bottom of the Atlantic. And FDR, even though the Neutrality Act sort of prevented it from doing a lot of things, he kept moving the boundaries of which the U.S. Navy would patrol to protect these ships.
Yes.
And then when he finally declared a national state of emergency, and he said, we're going to be basically moving all the way out the whole North Atlantic, he says, when you see a rattlesnake, you don't wait for him to strike. You crush him before he strikes. And these U-boats are the rattlesnakes of the Atlantic. Again, so simple an idea. If you see a rattlesnake, you're going to kill it, right? You're not going to let it bite you first. And he puts these images out there for the American public to understand why he's doing things. Mm-hmm. And again, this is part of this persuasive language that he uses to gradually shift American public opinion. There was a lot of pressure on him from Winston Churchill, from some of his own military advisors, from some of his political advisors. Come on, declare war on Nazi Germany. Why are you waiting? The British are desperate, And he understood that he couldn't do that until the American public was ready. What he had prepared the American public for 2 years, and then, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, overnight the entire country shifted. The whole isolationist movement essentially collapsed. And everything that he had talked about, the American spirit was awoken, and a sleeping giant arose and, ended up defeating fascism and protecting democracy for the rest of the world.
It's extraordinary. And you do a great job of laying out many challenges, but I'll just focus on one that he has to overcome. And that is this battle against misinformation and Nazi propaganda,
Yeah.
uh, propped up by people like Charles Lindbergh and many congressmen and senators and others, the America First movement. Say more about that and what actually happened, and what are the lessons for us today as we wrestle with sources of misinformation.
Well, and it's very similar that you know, Germany, Nazi Germany was trying to sow division in America and prevent people from supporting Great Britain. And you have to remember, a lot of people, a lot of Americans in the beginning part of the war, they were pro-German. You know, a lot of the horrors that came later weren't known initially. And America was a very anti-Semitic country. Even in 1942, a Gallup poll showed that 60% of Americans felt that Jewish refugees were a greater danger to America than Hitler.
It's extraordinary. And you do a great
So
job of documenting that, and even the anti Semitism within the State Department and other areas of government.
right. So Charles Lindbergh, of course, you know, was a global icon, one of the most famous men in the world for flying across the Atlantic solo in 1927. When his child is kidnapped and murdered, he becomes an even bigger celebrity, and he and his wife become the target of relentless media harassment. I mean, you know, a photographer broke into the morgue and took a picture of the dead baby and put her on the front page of the paper. I mean, it was horrible stuff. So in
Horrible.
1935, Lindbergh leaves America and goes and lives in England and Europe for several years. And while he's there, he's the most famous flyer in the world. Everybody wants him to fly their planes, the British, the French, the Italians, the Russians, the Germans. And so he goes around, he flies all these planes, and the German planes are just dramatically better. Their technology is better, their manufacturing is better, their training is better, their pilots are better. And he goes back and he tells French and the British, you know, military leaders that, look, you guys got to step up your game. They're way ahead of you. And every time he would fly these foreign planes, he would report back to the American embassy and say, these planes, the German planes are good. And then when things got bad in Germany after Kristallnacht and the violence against the Jews, he and his wife moved back to the United States. And then after Germany invades Poland, 3 days later, FDR gives his first fireside chat about the war, saying that we're a neutral nation, but even the Neutrality Act doesn't prevent an individual from following their conscience, right? And then just less than 2 weeks later, Lindbergh gives his first radio address in 10 years and just comes out of nowhere and makes this very compelling case for why America should not get involved in this war. And Lindbergh was charming, and he had this sort of Midwestern tone of voice, very relaxed. He never got particularly emotional. He spoke very logically. You know, the United States has two oceans. We're protected. We're a country of 130 million people. No one would dare to attack us. We don't need to get involved in these foreign nations. If we go to fight for democracy abroad, we may end up losing it here at home. And so right off the bat, it starts this, what I call the war of words between a private citizen, a global celebrity, but a private citizen, and the president of the United States on the major political, geopolitical, military issue of the day. And then at about the same time, a group of students at Yale create what they initially call the America First group. And it's not dissimilar to the campus protests against the Vietnam War in the 1960s. You know, these were students who were anti-war, not necessarily pro-German. And they brought in the president of the Sears and Roebuck Company to sort of run this organization. And it became a much more formal national group, and it had powerful backers. Henry Ford, William Randolph Hearst, Colonel Robert McCormick, the publisher of the Chicago Tribune and owner of the WGN, the biggest radio station in the country. So there were a lot of people who were very isolationist, and then there was a smaller subset that were pro-German, and then a subset who were anti-Semitic. And so you see this sort of movement swelling. And again, a majority of Americans believe this. And initially, Lindbergh doesn't really want to get involved with America First. He wants to maintain his independence. He wants to be able to say what he wants to say. The Republicans actually want to run him as their candidate in the 1940 election against Roosevelt, but he says, no, I don't want to be a politician. I don't want to, throw my life away, is what he said to one person. But by 1941, after Roosevelt gets reelected, Lindbergh realizes that the isolationists are losing. And he said we have to bring everybody together, and he would become the spokesperson for America First, which would become the primary umbrella organization for all the isolationists. And his rhetoric keeps getting more and more um, divisive. He claims that Roosevelt was elected under false pretenses. He lied about his war plans, and he cheated, and his election should be invalidated. He said that he's going to get us into this war. He has secret plans, and if he's reelected, he'll never step down. He'll be a dictator for life. And then, of course, he pretty consistently used these anti-Semitic tropes, like there's a small minority of Americans who control the media, the newspapers, and the Hollywood studios. And then at a speech he gives in Des Moines in late 1941, he comes right out and says, the three groups that are most actively pushing us into war are the British, the Roosevelt administration, and the Jews. And he says, and it's the Jews that are most dangerous because they control our media. And he goes on to say that, of all people, they're the ones who are going to suffer the most if we get into this war. And he can understand why they want us to get into the war because of the horrible treatment of the Jews in Germany.
Right.
So it's a pretty radical position he stakes out as the America First movement becomes more and more pro-German, pro-Nazi, not just anti-war.
Themes that obviously continue to echo today.
Yeah.
Let me bounce over to a couple of other connections between Roosevelt and Kennedy. They have very consequential first ladies. Eleanor Roosevelt is amazing. Your account of her speaking at the convention in Chicago, right? FDR requesting that she come, and she comes, and her ability to command the room.
Yeah.
So ultimately, that FDR gets what he wants. Tell us more about that. I'm just amazed by Eleanor.
Well, so FDR's decision to run for a third term was violating a sacred tradition, not a law, but a
Mhm.
sacred tradition that George Washington himself had established, limiting a president to 2 terms. And so he didn't want to actively campaign for the nomination, but and he could be a very manipulative guy. And by the way, he promised several people that they would be the candidate, not him. But so he wants to be acclaimed the nominee at this convention, and so they maneuver it, and he gets acclaimed the nominee. But he also promised a number of different people that they would be the vice president, because his vice president that served for the first 2 terms, Cactus Jack Garner from Texas, very right wing conservative Democrat. He's the one who famously said, "Office of vice president isn't worth a warm bucket of." Some people say spit, some people say something else. But FDR wanted his agricultural secretary, Henry Wallace, who was a very far left New Dealer,
Mhm.
had sort of mystical occult tendencies, which a lot of people were nervous about. And the Democratic power brokers did not want him to be the vice president because there was fear that FDR was not that healthy. More importantly, they didn't want him becoming president when FDR finally does step down. So there's a absolute brawl on the floor of the Democratic convention. The whole thing is just descending into chaos. The FDR is back at the White House in Washington. His team is calling him saying, "You've got to get out of here, boss. It's all going to hell. We thought we had it all wrapped up, and now it's chaos." And so what does FDR do? He calls Eleanor, who's home at Valkill and at Hyde Park. And she doesn't want to get in this mess. But a number of other, friends of hers call her, including Frances Perkins. I think Frances Perkins is probably the one who really sort of convinces her. So she gets on a plane, flies to Chicago, arrives, 9 o'clock, gets to the convention center around 10. It's middle of July, it's hot as heck, no air conditioning, 15,000 people. They've been fighting, literally grabbing signs out of each other's hands and banging each other over the head with them. She's unannounced. She walks out on the stage, and suddenly people start realizing that's Eleanor Roosevelt. And at first they cheer, and everything, and then the crowd sort of finally quiets down. And I went to look at the draft of her speech for this, figuring, because in it she says, you have to support my husband. You have to give him the tools he needs in this terrible, terrible time. Meaning you have to give him his choice as vice president. And she says, this is no ordinary time.
I
He
love that
needs your
phrase.
help. And of course, it's the title of Doris Kearns Goodwin's Pulitzer Prize winning book. It's a phrase that has come to, again, represent that entire period of time. And if you look at her speech, it's a half a page of notes, not a written formal speech at all. And the phrase "no ordinary time" doesn't even appear. She ad-libbed that line in front of 15,000 people in this incredibly tense moment. And it just goes to show sort of the remarkable ability she had to convey empathy to the audience. She understands they're upset, but she has to convince them that they need to support her husband, and she does it. And the crowd just goes crazy. And when she walks off the stage, they're clapping and screaming and yelling, and they almost immediately, nominate Henry Wallace to be vice president. And it just goes to show the sort of remarkable influence she had, how beloved she was in the Democratic Party. And again, the power of words. She was able in less than 15 minutes to completely change the dynamic of this very hostile environment.
Love it. I want to come back to this power of words because certainly a lot of people today lamenting the rise of texting and Twitter and, shall we say, less than civil discourse in our political sphere. Why don't we make them like we used to make them? And they're rare. They're rare orators at this level. But I want to read a section that particularly struck me. And this is Roosevelt's last campaign speech in Cleveland. The surge of events abroad has made some few doubters among us ask, is this the end of a story that has been told? Is the book of democracy now to be closed and placed away upon the dusty shelves of time? And the audience answers no, almost in unison. My answer is this. All we have known of the glories of democracy, its freedom, its efficiency as a mode of living, its ability to meet the aspiration of the common man, all of these are merely an introduction to the greater story of a more glorious future. And he goes on. It's just so powerful and so perfect.
Yeah, and he goes on to say, the American people will not go back. We will go forward.
Go forward.
And I think the sentiment that he's expressing about this idea of democracy having run its course, I think is perhaps the most important thread throughout his presidency. This is his core belief. He says it over and over and over again. In a number of his speeches, he uses biblical references. In one of the speeches he gives in that campaign, he talks about, like Moses, I want to bring the ship to shore so we can safely land through the storm, we're going through this terrible storm. And I think there's a fundamental American value about this idea that every generation has to reinvent our democracy. It's not a static thing, right? It's an evolving, changing, growing, mutating, stepping forward, stepping back thing. I think one of FDR's greatest lines was from the 1936 convention when he says, this generation has a rendezvous with destiny. And again, echoing JFK, again, and it was a prescient thought. I mean, at that point, war was not really on the horizon, but he understood that there were global forces at work, that this generation, the greatest generation, was going to have to rise to this challenge, and that they had a rendezvous with destiny. And you see this deep belief that he has in the American system, the deep belief he has in the American people, that no matter how bad things are, we're going to get through it, right? The system will eventually come around and do the right thing. As Winston Churchill says, the Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else.
Yes. I also admire your treatment in the book that that Roosevelt is not a perfect human being. He's a human being. There are flaws. He didn't get it all right. Can you say something about some of the things he didn't get right or didn't do right?
Well, I think to me there are these clear flaws in his personality before he has polio. He's a dilettante in a sense. He's a spoiled rich kid. He cheats on his wife, Eleanor, and 1918 when he's assistant secretary of the Navy with the young woman who Eleanor had hired as a social secretary. And Eleanor offers him a divorce, but he says no. Or actually, his mother says, if you divorce her, I'm going to disown you. So he swears that he will never see or communicate with Lucy Mercer again, and they stay together. But the marriage is sort of has moved into a formal partnership more than a romantic union. But he keeps in contact with her. He keeps corresponding with her through her whole life. She attends all four of his secretly attends all four of his inaugurations. And then after her husband dies in 1944, she starts coming to the White House for these secret rendezvous, some of which were arranged by Franklin's daughter, Anna, without Eleanor's knowledge. So, there is this secret side to him. From a personal standpoint, I think he had trouble dealing with Eleanor's role as the conscience of the administration. FDR was a pragmatic politician. And as hard as Eleanor fought, for example, to pass a federal anti-lynching law, you would think that would be pretty simple.
Mhm.
Anti-lynching, you shouldn't hang people from trees, right?
Right.
But FDR wouldn't support it because he knew that the Southern conservative Democrats who controlled all the committees in the Senate would never pass any of his legislation if he did. So he made some would say cynical, some would say practical decision that, I can uh, help millions of people through my New Deal legislation if I don't support federal anti-lynching laws. So I'm not going to. I think probably the gravest um, tarnish of his administration is in February of 1942 when he executes Executive Order 9066, which is the military exclusionary zone on the West Coast, giving the military authority to remove any people they consider a danger, which of course led to the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans, 80,000 of whom were American citizens. And Eleanor fought him on this, but the political powers aligned to do something. The panic on the West Coast after Pearl Harbor. This is one of those interesting, bizarro world scenarios where the Attorney General of California, who's running for governor, is the strongest voice arguing to put all these Japanese Americans in prison in camps. Earl Warren, of course, who went on to become one of the great civil rights champions when he was on the Supreme Court,
Yes.
and the voice arguing most strongly against incarcerating these Japanese American citizens was J. Edgar Hoover, who said, we knew who the Japanese spies were. We arrested them all right after Pearl Harbor. These people are loyal American citizens. You shouldn't incarcerate them. J. Edgar Hoover, the violator of more civil rights than any other. I mean, so it was a crazy time. But I do think that the incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II was perhaps his greatest mistake. I understand it sort of intellectually why he had to do it because of the power of the West Coast congressional delegations, the same issue that they could block his funding that he needed for his military. But morally, it was unconscionable.
This is a bit of a side note. You start out acknowledging the National Archives and Records Administration. Obviously, the system of presidential libraries wouldn't exist were it not for FDR. Can you say something both about FDR's involvement in creating this system and something encouraging Americans to actually use this system, that the people's records are there for them?
Well, FDR was, some people called him a collector, some people called him a pack rat. But, he collected um, naval manuscripts, historic manuscripts, prints, naval prints of every major battle. He collected ship models. He collected stamps, famously collected stamps. He collected books. He had 22,000 books in his personal collection, many of which had to do with naval history. He was very fascinated with naval history. His family had kept basically everything he ever wrote from the time he was 16. And in 1937, he had a commission look at what previous presidents had done with their papers. Because at that point, presidential papers were personal property of the president. When the president left office, he just took everything with him. It was considered his personal property. They could do whatever they want. Some presidents, gave some of it to colleges or to libraries of Congress. One president burned them. Some of them were stored in a warehouse and eaten by rats. Many of them were damaged. There was no coherent strategy, and there was almost no entire collection of a president's papers for historians to go in and look at. So he really felt strongly that he wanted all of his papers in one place where historians could come and look at it. And as much as possible, he wanted to get all the other senior members of his administration to donate their papers as well. Now, the National Archives building on Pennsylvania Avenue opened during FDR's presidency. It was started under Hoover, but that big building was opened under his presidency. And FDR really considered himself, a champion of this idea of federal records, our national memory. It's very well known that, the Declaration of Independence was tacked to the wall of a federal office building where the sun shone on it every day, and that's why you can't read it now. So he felt that they needed to be protected and preserved and made available to the American public. So he decided he was going to build a presidential library, raise private money for it, and then give it all to the American people through the National Archives. When they were debating this on Capitol Hill, because of course the federal government, if they took control of it, then they would have to pay for the upkeep of this and pay for the staffing. And one Republican said, we've got this big new building that just opened on Pennsylvania Avenue. He should put his records there so historians in the future can come down and look at them and realize how not to run a federal government. But the idea was so important because FDR not only raised the money and gave the building and gave the property, he gave his home, he gave, millions of dollars worth of personal items to this collection for the American people because he really believed it's important for the American public to understand how our government works. And all of those papers in the FDR library are available to the public. Any person can come in, fill out a form, and ask to see those documents. Now, some of the ones that are fragile person may be served a copy of it rather than the original. But if you're an historian, you're really looking for something, they will give you the original to look at. And like I said, when I held that piece of paper of the first page of the Day of Infamy speech, I mean, even now, the hair stands up on my arms. There's a power and a potency to those real documents. And of course, since then, all the presidents up until Obama had created some kind of presidential library in association with the National Archives. And those papers are available to the American people. And it's important for us to understand there is no other country in the world that does that. Right? We are unique in this transparency. Now, I'm not going to be silly here and say it's a perfect system. It's a terrible system in many ways. It's just better than every other system out there.
Yes.
And what's important is the knowledge that those records will eventually be made public, right? If you know that, what you write in your diary is going to be on the front page of the Washington Post, it's going to change what you write in your diary, right? And this idea is that the American public has a right to know why these decisions were made, how these decisions were made, who was in the room when it happened, which is, one of the things I really set out to do was to try to put the reader in the room when these speeches are being written, when these speeches are being given, to give them a feel for what it was like for the people who were actually crafting this language, whether it was Lindbergh or Roosevelt or Churchill, right? These are important moments, and to feel that these are real people. These aren't abstract historical, figures. These are real people facing incredibly complex challenges, and that ability to feel like you understand what they're doing. One of my favorite scenes is when FDR is taking a train down to Florida to go on this cruise, and all the reporters all crowd into this room. And I wanted people to start sweating in that hot, humid Florida weather, as they're approaching the beach, because, I want them to understand that these are real relationships between FDR and the reporters. There's a lot of scenes where he deals with this press corps that follows him everywhere. He did almost 1,000 press conferences during his administration. So and the best part is that there are verbatim transcripts of all of these press conferences. So you can actually see the sort of funny banter he has with them, who he makes fun of, who he picks on, how they challenge him. And so you really get a feel for how this dynamic evolved. And as you said earlier, his famous line about if your neighbor's house is on fire, of course you're going to lend him your garden hose. He said that at a press conference in a sort of very offhanded way, that he was laying the foundation for what became the Lend-Lease Act.
The way you laid out the evolution of the inputs and his thinking to result in that Extraordinary job.
Thanks.
We have some questions. So I'm going to paraphrase a bit, but essentially, we live in a modern era where information and misinformation can bombard us from a variety of sources, and perhaps even though there's a lot of good to democratizing the ability to broadcast information, you can now have influencers with no credentials who, and certainly do not have to label themselves as lobbyists for a foreign power, can distribute information freely. And so there are many theories about do we need to educate Americans differently so that we are more critical thinkers, more discerning thinkers, better able, what can we do to strengthen our culture so that we are less susceptible to misinformation and propaganda from outer sources?
Well, there's a movement that started about 10, 12 years ago, news literacy, digital literacy, an effort started at college campuses. You're starting to see it now moving into high schools, which is very specific at trying to help people understand how do you parse this fire hose of information that's coming at you? How do you determine, okay, who's the source of this? Where did this information come from? Who is saying it? What is their agenda? So you can look at a influencer on TikTok and say, okay, this person is pitching this makeup. Are they being paid to do that? Are they being paid to wear these clothes? Are they being paid to say Russian propaganda? Because as we've recently discovered, there's several of them out there that have been busted for just spewing Russian propaganda and being paid millions of dollars for it. So the most important thing, and it goes back to our founding fathers, you need an informed electorate. Democracy only works if you have an informed electorate. And it's the individual's responsibility to wade through the noise. I mean, if you want to talk about foreign interference in American elections, it starts in 1800, right? In the Adams-Jefferson race, where you had England and France both trying to sway the election because, France wanted Jefferson, England wanted Adams, right? And so you saw that foreign interference, and they
Yes.
literally owned newspapers, and they could just print whatever they wanted in there. And that foreign influence has been present in varying degrees throughout our history. And let's not kid ourselves. The Americans have interfered with foreign elections as well, using the same techniques, false newspapers, planting false news stories, paying people off to report things they want to report. So it goes both ways. And we have to live in a world where we understand that a large chunk of the information that's coming at us has an agenda, whether it's to buy something or whether it's to support a politician or whether it's to support or oppose specific economic or diplomatic policies. And we have to be able to say, this is real, this is not. So you look at the phenomenon of QAnon now and the phenomenon of the conspiracy theories, and you really say, what motivates people to go down those rabbit holes and believe these things which are so, patently false, and yet many of them invest their life savings or they break the law and they go to jail in support of these conspiracy theories. So it always comes back to the individual. Individual has to be given the tools, the informational tools at a young age, preferably middle school, where they first start understanding that this information coming at them just because it's on their phone doesn't mean it's true. And then they have to build that as they go through adulthood, understanding at all times. I don't have to agree with all these people, but I at least have to understand who's saying this and why are they saying it.
Absolutely. Another question, can you speak to how FDR's role and service in the Navy in World War I influenced his presidency in World War II?
Well, enormously. I mean, FDR was a big believer in the power of the U.S. Navy. He argued very strongly prior to America's entry in World War I to expand the Navy. As a matter of fact, the famous incident where his boss, the Secretary of the Navy, was out of town, and FDR had the temporary authority, and he authorized the construction of a half a dozen ships. And when his boss got back, he was ticked off, but he didn't want to go over it, so it went forward. So FDR strongly believed in naval power. Like I said, he was incredibly well versed in the history of the U.S. Navy, in the history of global naval power. It's one of the things that he and Churchill bonded over. because both of them had served as senior officers in their navies during the First World War. Both of them understood the importance of being able to project naval power globally. Obviously, the Royal Navy had controlled the seas for 200 years. So Britain had always had this role. The American Navy had been much more of a protective service around American shores and American shipping. But so his role as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I absolutely founded his belief in the importance of building up the U.S. Navy. And of course, he started trying to build up the American military in the mid 1930s. But during the Great Depression, it was very hard to get congressional funding for military. At the start of World War II, when Germany had 2 million men, invading Poland, the America had only 200,000 men in uniform and less than 200 planes that flew. So we were hopelessly unprepared, despite everything FDR had done.
Yeah. So this is a very different question. And this is back to the first ladies. If would you make the case that Eleanor Roosevelt is one of the most consequential first ladies in American history?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would argue that she is the most influential first lady and probably the most influential former first lady. If you look at her life from 1945 to 1962,
right,
the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, her civil rights work, it's extraordinary.
I think as much as I'm a huge fan of the Kennedy administration, I may have to concede that point to you.
Well, so interesting story. In 1946 or 47, Gallup started this poll of Americans about what woman in America they respected the most. And so for 13 years, Eleanor Roosevelt won every year. She lost in 1962 to Jackie Kennedy. So there was a passing of the torch there. I think Jackie Kennedy was certainly, and I don't mean this sarcastically, much more influential in cultural and social transformation, right? She was representing a new era for women, not just in the way she dressed, because obviously everybody wants to talk about her wonderful clothes and what elegant style she had, but also the role of women in society in a different way, right? Eleanor was very much, we need to fight, we need to change America. Remember, she came up, as the first generation of women who were allowed to vote. And so she saw the political power of women in a very sort of vital way, that women can change America because the things that are important to women are different than things that are important to men. I think what Jackie Kennedy did was she elevated the sense of American style and class, and she gave American women a level of respect in the world that, in many ways they simply hadn't had. The way she brought art and culture into the White House, those were all very important things. And it's hard to weigh which is more important. They were different time periods, but I do think Jackie Kennedy had as big an influence on American culture as any woman who ever was first lady.
Yeah. Can you say more about FDR and his rapport with the press and his using the press not only to connect with the American people, but to continually, as you mentioned in the book, like a chess player, very skillfully advance an agenda?
So there's two different levels to that question, because most of the publishers and the owners of big newspapers didn't like FDR. He was a traitor to their class, right? What is this rich guy doing trying to take our money away and give it to the poor people? What's wrong with him? This is not what you're supposed to do. So the publishers really didn't care for him very much. The reporters, even the conservative reporters who maybe didn't agree with his policies, really liked him. I mean, he was an incredibly charming man. He had charisma, just, at a level that few presidents have. Kennedy, Reagan, at that level of his ability to charm people. Even Bill Clinton had that sort of charisma. When he would come into a room, everybody would look at him. And I think the fact that FDR made himself so available, which was such a radical departure from the 12 years of Republican presidents prior to him, who hated the press, didn't like doing press conferences, thought they were beneath them. And he comes in, and the first couple of years of his presidency, he's doing 3 press conferences a week in the Oval Office, and they all just crowded in and crowded around, and he would talk with them, and they would ask questions, and he would say, "This is off the record," or "This is background," or "You can use that," or and he made their lives. Um, it made them very important to their newspapers because everybody wanted to get an FDR quote. And
Mhm.
go back to first ladies for a second.
Yeah.
Women were not allowed to attend FDR's press conferences. Women were not allowed in the Oval Office. So Eleanor decided that she would have a press conferences every week in which only women reporters were allowed. And so all these newspapers had to hire women journalists to go cover Eleanor Roosevelt. And she single-handedly transformed the staffs of major newspapers because they had to hire women to cover Eleanor. So they had a very dynamic relationship with the press. FDR, like all presidents, would get angry with them if they reported things he didn't like. He would often call them out in these press conferences. Hey, Jimmy, I didn't like that story last night. You got it all wrong. That's not what I said. Um, and when he traveled, there was a rule that the press would not take photographs of him being carried in and out of the car because he couldn't walk. Obviously, he was paralyzed, and being put in wheelchairs. There are very few photographs of him, despite the fact that everywhere he went, he was surrounded by photographers.
Yes.
Very few photographs of him in a wheelchair or being carried or walking. You see some footage of him walking. He would wear these heavy steel braces on his legs that allowed him to sort of do this weird shuffle back and forth, but he had to be holding on to one of his aides or his son's arm tightly and have a cane in the other hand. And then when he would get to the podium, he would grab onto the podium to hold himself up. So the press agreed to this, and they almost never showed images of him or reported on the severity of his paralysis.
It's extraordinary. Given paralysis and often wheelchair bound or leg brace bound with that, he has the vigor, the energy to hold this number of press conferences, to tackle the most challenging issues that any president has ever faced, and yet still find time to play games with the press and mislead them and have affairs on the side. And like that guy, you know, was a true symbol of his age, of that era.
He was remarkable, and I think what happens, and I see the conference in Tehran in November 1943, the first of the big 3 conferences with Churchill, Stalin, and FDR, really as him at his most powerful moment. He has
Mhm.
emerged now as the leader of the Allied forces. America's the most powerful nation in the world. They're building, 10 times as many planes and tanks and ships and, trucks as all the other countries combined. We've gone from an army of 200,000 to 12 million in a matter
Mhm.
of 2 years. Um, and you see him, and he has this regal bearing as he's sitting between Churchill and Stalin. And he really is at the very peak of his power. On the way home, he catches pneumonia on the ship ride home, and he's ill for quite a while in the beginning of 1944. He actually takes the entire month of April off, disappears, goes to Bernard Baruch's estate down in South Carolina. Um, and this is the lead up to D-Day, remember? So there's lots going on.
Yes.
Um, and then he runs for president again in 44, at which point he's a fairly sick man, but he
Hmm.
continues to lead because he feels like I'm sending thousands of young men to die on the battlefield every day. I can't just walk away. I
Yes.
have to die in the saddle. And then and when you look at the pictures of him at Yalta with Churchill and Stalin again in February 1945, you see a shrunken man, a man who is really a very, very sad figure, still quite mentally active, but
Yes.
who's near death. And of course, he dies in April 1945.
Well, as you say, he has worked himself to death in service of his country.
Yep.
Like Kennedy, though very differently, he tragically dies in office.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, Paul, I would love to discuss this much longer, but I believe this is all the time that we are scheduled to chat. Can I conclude with a couple of thoughts from the book?
Absolutely.
You start by saying, my hope is that FDR's belief that the American spirit will rise to any challenge when freedom is threatened will inspire others as it has inspired me. And I have to say, this message comes across loud and clear in the book, and it is inspiring. And I have to thank you tremendously for doing the work to pull this book together. It's just wonderful.
Thank you, Alan. I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed the conversation. I thought we had another hour.
And I'll just say, as a reminder to folks, Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh and the Battle to Save Democracy by Paul M. Sparrow. Go get it, read it. Come to the JFK Library if you want to see our World War II exhibit, but you're going to have to come before January when it closes. And get over to the FDR Library and Museum and see those amazing collections. It is a one-of-a-kind menagerie. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you to our sponsors again. And mostly, Paul, thank you.
Thank you, Alan.